The investigative discovery TV show Guilty Rich does an episode on the Moxley murder, and we talk with a Moxley case expert who appeared on the episode, Len Levitt, as we continue our role as one of the lead broadcast sources on the 42-year-old tragic murder story tonight. On Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, and Len Levitt, as we say every time he's on, remains unsung hero of the Moxley murder story. He was hired by the Greenwich Time and Stamford Advocate to investigate the 1975 murder of Martha Moxley. Papers lacked the courage, though, to publish his reporting for years. An article he wrote in 1991 helped relaunch the police investigation, ultimately leading to the arrest and conviction of Michael Skakel in 2002 for the murder of 15-year-old next-door neighbor Martha Moxley. He's the author of Conviction about the Moxley-Skakel case, currently runs the website NYPD Confidential, been a reporter for the AP, Time, Detroit News, and Newsdays. Works appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Esquire, and Harper's. Good friend of the show, and he's in the studio with us. Good morning, Len.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
Tell us, first off, what were your impressions of the ID Guilty Rich episode, and how you felt that your interview was handled?
I thought my interview was handled well. I had no problems with that. I have no problems with the title. But the problem with the program is that you look at that and you say to yourself, they've produced no evidence to show that Michael Skakel was guilty. And anybody watching that would say, what'd they have on Michael? Nothing.
In fact, you might even say that Tommy looked worse.
I don't think either. I mean, but nonetheless, they produced no evidence to show that either one of them had definitively murdered Martha. That's the thing. If somebody was on a jury looking at the program, acquit, they would say.
Yeah, I didn't think that they moved the ball forward much, other than Ken Littleton speaking out for the first time, which we'll talk about. But I want to ask you a question going to your Daily Beast article. It was the first time I'd read this really anywhere. You wrote, there's 100% certainty that either Michael Skakel, Tommy Skakel, or Jimmy Terrian committed the murder. Where did that come from, that 100% certainty?
Well, let's look at what happened. She's beaten to death 10 to 15 to 20 times around the head with a golf club. She's stabbed through the neck. That's known as overkill in law enforcement jargon. It implies a personal rage that the killer knew the victim and was absolutely furious at her for some reason or other. Ken Littleton didn't know her. Michael Skakel and Tommy Skakel, who were the last known people to be with her, did know her. There was a sexual connotation to her death, and in Michael's book proposal, he talks about his longing for Martha. Tommy, in his story, talks about mutual masturbation to orgasm. He's lied about the time frame. He's lied about what happened that night, and he's changed his story. Michael also, and Jimmy Terrian. I don't say that Jimmy Terrian murdered Martha Moxley. I think they could have had help from Jimmy Terrian, in that in that he knew about the thing. And the interesting thing with Jimmy Terrian is that when he was forced to testify at Michael's trial, and Michael went up to give him a big hug. Michael called him the captain of mayhem in his memoir, his unpublished memoir. But when Michael went to hug Jimmy Terrian, who he hadn't seen in a long time, Terrian walked right past him.
Tell people who Jimmy Terrian is.
Jimmy Terrian is a first cousin of Michael and Tommy, and he also had a tough bringing up in that his parents were alcoholics. His father died, I understand, the day that he was born from drinking. His mother was an alcoholic. He had a stepfather who he didn't like, really didn't like. I mean, there was real trouble between the two of them. And he's had a tough life.
Mr. Mayhem. We should say that the Terrians, of course, is the place in the back country where Michael was allegedly that night to get his alibi.
Right.
So this overkill thing, obviously Bobby Kennedy has put forth the Caveman Theory, which by definition looks like an overkill and accuses an African-American, Al Hasbrook, who supposedly was identified by Tony Bryant, who's an African-American. Is this a lynching of an innocent person, or do we have to look into that there might have been a caveman explanation for this overkill?
Not only is it a lynching of a person, it's a racist lynching. Bobby Kennedy took the word of a convicted felon, of a guy who's lied throughout his whole life, Kobe Bryant, and used the perfect racial stereotype, of a wild black man, out of control black man who was who has no connection to this thing whatsoever. Al Hasbrook never knew Martha Moxley. The guy he was with never knew Martha Moxley. It's absolutely, not only is it unconscionable, but it is preposterous to suggest that these two guys had anything to do with Martha Moxley's murder.
Ken Littleton now, who was obviously a major suspect and whose life also collapsed, how do you and he's never spoken out really, how do you think he acquitted himself and came across?
I think Littleton acquitted himself quite well. I mean, Littleton is, a guy who's really messed up. There's a history of mental illness in his family, and that was played out with Littleton for at least a 10-year period. Littleton was so messed. I mean, his mind was so messed up that at the trial, his ex-wife was there and testified, and she hadn't seen him in a while, and she jokingly said, "Hi, I'm Mary Baker," which is, Ken Littleton was married to her. They had 2 kids, and Ken Littleton said to her, "Hi, I'm Ken Littleton." He didn't recognize her.
Do you think? And he just moved in literally the day of the murder, which has to make us one of the worst senses of timing.
Timing, really. And there's another example. Ken Littleton did not know Martha Moxley. He'd never seen her. He'd never met her. What's his motive?
Talking about that, he does have a key role potentially in the fact that he's the first person that saw Tommy right after the sexual interlude around 10:15 during the French Connection. So do you think that gives you can talk about what he saw in Tommy's demeanor, and does that clear Tommy to some extent?
Well, I think it cleared Tommy in the eyes of Detective Frank Garr. I mean, Garr always felt that Littleton was the fact that Tommy, 15 minutes after supposedly Martha's death at that time, and we don't know that's for sure, mm-hmm. Littleton describes him as totally calm, totally normal. There's no blood on him. And I know Frank Garr's feeling, the Detective Frank Garr, was that how can you expect a 17-year-old boy to be that totally composed after having murdered somebody in a brutal fashion? And I think that was one of the reasons that he felt Tommy did not murder Martha. On the other hand, let's look at his statement to private investigators in 1991 or 1992 to private investigators when they were questioning him about the case and his whereabouts. And he admits that he lied to the police. And he tells the mutual masturbation story. And in the middle of this, he breaks down into tears. Now, the private investigators felt that Tommy murdered Martha. In fact, I know they felt that Tommy murdered Martha and he was about to confess. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think the position of the state investigators, especially of Frank Garr, was that he broke down into tears, but it's not clear that he was going to confess to the murder himself as much as he knew who did murder Martha. And Garr's feeling was that it was Michael. He was going to confess about Michael. But we don't know. And
Tommy, you would assume, would have some guilt because he inadvertently set Michael off, assuming that Michael was watching him in the bushes.
I think that would be true if, in fact, Martha was killed at
around 10 o'clock.
Around 10 o'clock at night. On the other hand, if she was killed around midnight, which is also possible, and Tommy was out there again with Martha, and Michael came back from the Terrians and saw them there, the same scenario would apply. The same guilt would apply.
What do you think about, is there any relevance to this? Ken Littleton also told the story of playing golf behind Michael at the Greenwich Country Club, seeing Michael take a golf club, kill a chipmunk, and then nail it with the tees. Do we draw necessarily a fair conclusion that means he's capable of killing a human with a golf club like that?
That's a good question, and the question also is, was that an isolated instance?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't an isolated instance, and there's a person named Andy Pugh, who was a great friend of Michael at the time, who told investigators that he did he exhibited this kind of behavior regularly. There was an incident, I think, with some small animal, maybe a squirrel, where Michael would put breadcrumbs around, and when the animal would come, he would bash him with a club or whatever. And the problem with that is that law enforcement people always feel that somebody, who's got a history of cruelty like that has got enough anger inside of him that he could kill a human. But again, the problem with this case is there is no hard evidence linking Michael to the murder.
In fact, he had an airtight alibi until he himself put himself
That's
at the crime scene. In there, it talks about them in their childhood years as Michael being more unhinged and Tommy being more explosive. That would, to me, make Tommy look a little worse under those.
Yeah, I don't know what that means about Tommy is more explosive. I mean, they were both out of control.
Uh-huh.
Tommy had a head injury when he fell out of a car when he was 4 years old, and he was volatile. Michael was more out of control, as I understand it, and the fact that there was a thing in the private investigator's report which said that the difference between Michael and Tommy was that Tommy always felt loved by his family and Michael did not. And if you look at Michael's memoir, again, he talks about how he felt his father hated him,
beat him,
tormented him, as did Tommy. I mean, the two of them, there's no such thing as brotherly love between the two of those guys at the time. And, Michael was really in a desperate situation. There was a time when they caught him wearing his mother's clothes, and the father was, extremely upset about that. And, there was physical abuse and emotional abuse, and it was a family of, as Andy Pugh described it, I mean, there were bloody, vicious fights between all these kids at the time, and it was a frightening situation.
It's a sad thing because the mother was apparently a great person, and her death destroyed the whole family. But I read that in the Daily Beast about Tommy feeling loved and Michael feeling not. And so that's the first time I saw it. I think it's an incredibly profound statement. The Sutton report also, to me, rules out, if you believe it, that it was somebody obviously from the same socioeconomic, would rule out the Caveman and Littleton, sexually immature, capable of a psychotic episode, someone that was within walking distance. All of that points to the two boys.
Everything points to the two boys. And, when you mention the Caveman, I mean, this is so ludicrous. Here's a guy who grew up in the Bronx, who goes to the Army, who goes to college, who's had a job for for years, who's married, has got a family, and because he's a black man, Bobby Kennedy uses this caveman stereotype to portray this poor guy as a murderer. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, coming from that family, which talked a good game about civil rights and helping blacks, this is absolutely ludicrous.
Now, not to stick up for Bobby, but he got this from Tony Bryant, who is black. Where is Tony Bryant coming from on this?
Let's talk about that for a minute. So Tony Bryant is an African American, big deal. The fact is that Tony Bryant has got a history of of making things up. He wouldn't testify to this to law enforcement authorities. He wanted to make a movie at one point. I mean, God only knows his his motive for doing this, but Bobby Kennedy bought it because he wanted to buy it, hook, line, and sinker. Yeah. I should say one other thing here. Go. There's one other person who bought this line, and he's a very important person in this case, and that's Connecticut State Supreme Court Justice Richard Palmer, who is the senior judge on this case now. In an appeal that they made, that the Skakels made, which was turned down by the court. Palmer is the only judge who says something like, this is credible. Why would Tony Bryant make this up? Well, there are plenty of reasons why Tony Bryant would make this up, starting with his own messed up life. But Judge Palmer now is the person who is in control of the Skakel case from a judicial standpoint.
And we're going to talk about him in the next segment, so we'll go into more detail then. Staying on this for a second, Michael puts himself at the crime scene. Nobody else does. And then there's this masturbated to orgasm deal, right, which conveniently provides DNA. I don't know. I want to get your assessment of whether you think that's why he did it. But the other part is, when I interviewed Bobby Kennedy, every time he mentioned this, he said masturbated not to orgasm, which I assume he was meaning to imply that Michael wasn't trying to come up with a DNA excuse.
Well, I think masturbating to orgasm was Michael's story. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know if Bobby Kennedy knows Michael better than Michael does. But where's he coming up with that? Maybe Michael now says he didn't masturbate to orgasm. His own private investigators was that he did masturbate to orgasm. But here's the interesting thing here. And none of the judges picked it up when his attorney was appealing it. Michael says he climbed a tree outside Martha's window and did this. Well, there was no tree outside Martha's window that he was able to climb. There was a tree, and the tree was right at the murder scene under which her body was found. So when the Skakels attorney, Hubie Santos, presented this thing on appeal, and he's giving his oral arguments, and he said, where did this tree come up from? Hey, it wasn't the state of Connecticut that came up with the tree. It was Michael that came up with the tree, and none of the judges who were sitting there questioning him called him on it. I
think Andy Pugh, who was one of Michael's best friends, also said that Michael told him it was the pine tree, which is where the body was.
That's exactly right.
Elan School now, that obviously was a big component of the conviction. You've had interesting insights on that. Number one, that he was put there in the 80s when he was not a suspect. So go ahead on that.
Yeah, this is another really fascinating part of this case. Michael is sent there after a drunken driving accident when he's 17 or 18. And the passenger he was with was almost killed, and he ran away. And according to the private investigators, he said, "Next time I won't get caught." So what happened was that Rushton Skakel's lawyer, a guy named Tom Sheridan, organized a kidnapping, really, and they took Michael in a plane, brought him to this place called Elan, which is a really, really bad place. But here's the interesting thing about Elan. Everybody questioned Michael, and they would torture him with this. Why did you kill your neighbor? Why did you kill Martha Moxley? Hey, how did they know that? To ask him that. Michael wasn't a suspect then. Tommy was the prime suspect. The suggestion is that the family all knew about it and somehow passed the word along to the people at Elan. And again, the question comes up: why were they saying that to Michael?
Let me ask you this in our final couple minutes here. Do you believe that the Skakel family is involved in a conspiracy of silence to cover this up? And you know how tough it is to keep conspiracies going forever.
I do think that people in the Skakel family knew about this thing. I don't believe that the family together, came up with these preposterous stories. But I do think that, in fact, I know Rustin Skakel suspected that Michael had murdered Martha, and we know that because of an interview that Frank R. conducted with Sissy Ix and her husband, Robert Ix, where they acknowledged that Rustin came to them with a horrible suspicion that Michael had murdered.
Now, did they renege on that story?
Yes, they reneged to me. I asked Mr. Ricks, what about that? And he said, I have no recollection of that or something like that. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, how can you not recollect something like that? Sissy Ix was asked to testify. She at the last minute, she backed off, said she never said that. Make of that what you will.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll look at the murder case current status. We'll get to Judge Palmer as well with Glenn Levitt as soon as we get back. And we're back with investigative journalist, Moxley murder expert Len Levitt. We're going to look at the current status. The first question I have is, they had the ruling that found Mickey was incompetent. That's now been overturned. And Skakel's out on a $1.2 million bail. Why would he not have to go back into jail because it's still open on the final appeal?
You got me on that one. What seems to me is that there's no accountability for judges of Connecticut's highest court. They do whatever they want. They give no explanation. And, maybe people of Connecticut want it that way, but my experience covering the judiciary in New York is that there's usually a problem when that occurs. And here what happened was they overturned the decision of a judge that Skakel's lawyer was incompetent, so now the ruling is he was competent. And then Skakel's lawyer asked for a reconsideration, which is a term that I don't really know, and apparently prosecutors in Connecticut don't know it when it applies to a murder case because it's never been done before. But nonetheless, this is under reconsideration now, and not only did Skakel's lawyer call for a reconsideration, but he wanted – let me back up a minute. The judge who wrote the decision overturning the original decision about the lawyers being incompetent retired after he wrote it. So the attorney for Skakel wanted the new judge to be the judge who replaced that first judge to be part of the reconsideration. And the reason he wanted that was that that would be could be a 4-3 decision. If they only had the 6 remaining judges who would do the reconsideration, if they would split 3-3 and the decision would be upheld. Mm-hmm. So this is back in January, I believe, when the reconsideration motion was when the decision was overturned. It's now September. We don't know what's going on. Whenever I call up, the spokesman for the court says, "Well, it's under reconsideration, and we have no comment." We don't know how long this is going to go on for. As I say, there's no accountability. But here's the key part to this: that in one of the appeals about Tony Bryant and the caveman business, Judge Palmer, in a dissenting opinion from the court, which rejected Bryant's claims, said that this sounded credible to him, and why would Tony Bryant make something like this up? So you get a sense of where he's coming from on this, and he's the senior judge who's directing the process. So I would say we just have to wait and see, and Connecticut citizens can, if they're content with that, so be it.
Let me ask you this, because this is an interesting thing. I saw Alan Dershowitz and Al Dressler, who was Vito Colucci's assistant, sent me this. Alan Dershowitz said that to say that they used the wrong third-party culpability without knowing inside of the case is completely wrong, because what if the Skakels basically, even by inference and not admitting it, had said, do not put Tommy as the third party, right? Well, now the Skakels are saying he's incompetent because he didn't put Tommy as the third party, and Dershowitz is saying, what right does the judge have to try to get inside, the decision that Mickey may not have had choice on?
Absolutely right. I mean, the judge's decision was questionable. It was totally arbitrary. It was it all came out of his own head, as opposed to the law. And if you accept the fact that the lawyer Mickey Sherman was incompetent, what that means is that there got to be hundreds, if not thousands, of lawyers who were incompetent when people were convicted of crimes.
And this is the $2 million lawyer who was paid for this case.
Indeed, who admittedly had his own financial problems and his own head problems with this case.
The other issue raised then was that they did not bring forth Dennis Osorio, who was Georgianne Terrian's boyfriend, out in the backcountry that night because he would have been the only non-Skakel. Why is that significant?
I don't think it is significant. I think the judge was reaching. I think that's a complete stretch. There was plenty of evidence that was supplied that indicated that Michael had in fact gone to the Terrian house as he claimed. The problem with that, though, is that the prosecutor, Jonathan Benedict, gave a fantastic closing argument.
That was my next question. Explain what you meant by that. Stunningly convincing.
And what really cinched it was that he quoted one of the Skakel's friends who was at the house at the time, who said, "I saw Michael after the car left for the Skakels with his brothers in it." Yeah. That was Andrea Shakespeare. That was the key part to this thing. And Mickey Sherman did question her, but she was convinced, rightly or wrongly, that Michael did not go to the Terrian house with his brothers.
And Julie said that initially too, right? Who was with Andrea?
That's correct. But Julie, I don't put any stock in anything any Skakel says. I mean, they are complete and utter liars. They've lied from the beginning of this thing, and they're still lying. So, but Andrea Shakespeare is an independent witness. She's her father was a prominent guy with CBS. She's a friend of the Skakels, and here she says Michael didn't go to the Terrians. And again, as I say, that was the key in Jonathan Benedict's argument.
I said to Bobby Kennedy, too, think about the logic. You're 15 years old. Hormones are running. You're high. You're drunk. You can't stand your brother in terms of he's feeling Martha up on the spot. And then you say, I'm getting in a car to go watch a TV show.
And what did Bobby say?
Didn't say anything, by the way.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Mrs. Moxley, who's told me, she's told you, she's told everybody, she called the Terrian household at 3:30 in the morning and was told Jimmy was not there.
Correct. And when they asked whether it was she, I can't remember who it was, but somebody asked Tommy about the case, what do you know? And he said, go ask Jimmy Terrian. So, as I say, make of that as what you will.
Okay, now let's go to Judge Palmer and what's the reconsideration that's going on right now. And by the way, Bob Drake told me, who's an expert on this case, that the judge's writings are replete with factual errors. Well,
let me say about Bob Drake, he knows this case better than any living human being, except maybe Frank Garr, the detective on the case.
We're about to get to him, by the way.
Bob Drake is a genius. He knows stuff that nobody. He puts together stuff that, or comes up with stuff that nobody knows. I don't know the case well enough to say which things were the judges said were inaccurate or not. But if Bob Drake says it's true, go with it.
All right. We've talked about Tony Bryant. Let's move to the other issue that they brought up, which is that they charged that you and Frank Garr were going to do this book together, that he had therefore a conflict of interest. He may have leaked you stuff, and go on.
Well, again, that's what they tried to bring out in 2006. The judge rejected it. I think Hubie Santos was telling people that I secretly paid Frank Garr during the trial. Is that what it was? Let me give you a lesson in journalism 101. If I did that, I was covering the trial for Newsday. I would have needed Newsday's approval, which they certainly would not have given. That means then I paid him off secretly myself. Journalists don't have that kind of money. Hubie Santos was making, was another $2 million lawyer for the Skakels. There was nothing that Frank Garr told me before the trial. The fact that we did a book together, which started after the trial, the trial was over.
You hadn't planned all along that you were going to get together and do it, or?
Well, I said to him, I said, Frank, when this is over, we should really, write a book. And Frank said, nobody will believe us. You're wasting your time thinking about it. So, it was like there was no plot.
No conspiracy.
No conspiracy to, no secret conspiracy to write a book.
Frank Garr basically has a lot of integrity. You're going to represent, I assume, and you obviously were a journalist who that would be a violation.
Journalists don't. The only people who pay off people are the National Enquirer, and maybe if you work for Rupert Murdoch, but I don't. But here's the thing, Bobby Kennedy. It turns out, Bobby Kennedy has written a book making these accusations, and guess what? He sold his book to the movies. So, give me a break, Bobby.
Now, let me ask you this. Jack Solomon was the state investigator, and he was convinced Littleton did it, and then Frank R. replaced him, I think.
Correct.
Okay. Why did they have opposite conclusions, do you think?
Well, Jack was, as Frank explained it to me, Jack Solomon was in love with the polygraph, the lie detector test. You fail the lie detector test, that means you're guilty. That's nonsense, of course. People fail lie detectors all the time. Why do you think they're not admissible in court?
Yeah.
Because they're unreliable. Frank R. was much more intuitive than Solomon. I mean, he went with his gut a lot, and anybody who's, you just take a look at Littleton again. No motive. What was the motive? Jack Solomon. What was the motive for Littleton? He couldn't come up with one.
Frank R. Was said never interviewed Hasbrook, even though they maybe both live in Bridgeport. But Hasbrook did. Is there any reason he just wouldn't have interviewed him or pursued the angle at all once it came up?
Well, don't forget, this first came up before the trial. Mickey Sherman was aware of this thing, and he rejected it also. There's no reason to interview him. It's absolutely ridiculous. Plus, Hasbrook wouldn't. I don't know that Hasbrook would have agreed to an interview. And before you interview Hasbrook, you want to interview Tony Bryant. Tony Bryant's making these claims. Tony Bryant refused to be interviewed. So, I mean, this whole thing of
the caveman
of Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy's life is a train wreck, and this is the final act to it.
One thing that I find, it speaks to the integrity of the Belhaven folks, because a lot of them were very close to the Skakels. None of them have corroborated Tony Bryant's story, even though Tony says, I was at Neil Walker's house, I talked to Neil, I talked to Margie, they spent the night, the two murderers allegedly, in the burn house. No one has backed that up.
Tony Bryant strikes me, and I don't know the man, I've never met him, but he strikes me as a stone-cold liar and a manipulator of white people who want to buy this stuff. People say, well, he's an African-American. Big deal. He's a disturbed guy who's, participated in a kidnapping in California. He lied to his employers. He owes the government millions of dollars in back taxes. God only knows what says he's a cousin of Kobe Bryant, the basketball player. I don't know if that's true either. The guy's lied his whole life. Now,
Bobby Kennedy will tell you, as he's told us, that the Skakels and the Kennedys didn't get along. He didn't know Michael. Michael hated them for a while, maybe even Bobby. Why has Bobby, in your mind, risked his whole reputation to do this?
Well, first of all, I don't think he's risked his reputation because he has no reputation. He has a name. As I say, Bobby Kennedy's life has been a train wreck. He's an ex-heroin addict, alcoholic, passed out on a plane with a needle in his arm, got fired by Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau. And this is part of his, just a continuation of his life, as in my opinion.
Do you think he feels a sense of trying to protect Michael because Michael, in a way, saved his life? That's the story.
I do. I think Michael, as he says, Michael helped him with his alcoholism, and I do feel that he feels a sense of guilt. He's absolutely right that the Skakels hated the Kennedys. Kennedys hated the Skakels. In Michael's memoir, Michael blames the Kennedys for reopening the investigation, I think. And he was involved in some, a terrible Kennedy business when, what was it, Joe Kennedy, who's another I guess he's a first cousin, was running for governor, and his brother Michael Kennedy was involved with a teenage babysitter. The Kennedys all circled the wagon. Michael really went to, I guess that he went to the prosecutors with that information, because whatever you want to say about Michael, there was a certain degree of honesty in Michael Skakel. And what the Kennedys did was they claimed that Michael was trying to hit them up for $225,000 in bribes for making that story up, and he didn't make the story up. It was a true story.
The Judge Palmer and the reconsideration. Do you have any reason why it's taking so long? There are certain people that say that there's a new swing judge and they're trying to make sure that he votes the way they want to, which seems to me not kosher.
I can't go that far. You'll have to ask Judge Palmer. And I mean, I think that, frankly, I've mentioned the lack of accountability the judges in Connecticut and the Supreme Court apparently have, and it's time for the newspapers to start asking those questions. I know John Moxley and Dorothy Moxley wrote a letter to the Hartford Courant, but it's really time for some Hartford reporter to get on this thing, or for the Hartford Courant to get on this thing. Because, I mean, I've written stuff about it, but I'm in New York for the most part.
Yeah. I
don't have much clout in Connecticut, I don't think. And but there are people in Connecticut that do have clout in the media, and it's time for them, in my opinion, to start asking some hard questions.
Well, what is the chances of a reconsideration for motion like this being successful at this level of appeal? Is it minuscule?
It's never happened. I mean,
never happened.
According to the prosecutor I talked to in Stamford, he said he's never heard of this in a murder case.
As we finish off this segment, why do you think that the Greenwich Time and the Stamford Advocate did not publish your article?
I wish I knew the answer to that. That's been a question for me for 20 years.
You don't think anybody put the fix in or hammer on them or the Skakels? I mean, that seems...
I don't know. I never thought that. I think it was just a lack of courage by the editor, and he got the publisher involved. They had lawyers involved. You get lawyers involved in stories, and there's always trouble. But I think it was the editor's lack of courage, because I say that because in 1995, when I was given parts of the Sutton report and reported that Michael and Tommy had lied about their whereabouts the night of the murder, and that Tommy had told that mutual masturbation story, and I went to the Stamford Advocate with it again. The publisher was gone by then, but the editor was there, and he wouldn't publish that story. And finally, I got Newsday to publish it, and the next day they published it in the Advocate and the Greenwich Time, which means he was happy to publish it after somebody else did it first.
And Newsday had no issue publishing it?
Well, they did, actually. I had a lot of trouble. That's a terrible story. I don't want to bore you with it, but I worked for New York Newsday, which folded the week that I got a hold of the Sutton report.
Wow.
So I was left. They continued, a remnant of them continued to publish, and so I went to the Long Island Newsday and the major part of that paper, and they said they had no interest in the story. So it was not a good time for me, and I went back. Finally, it ended up appearing in what was left of New York Newsday with a very small circulation, and we could only pray that the wire services would pick it up, and they played it on page 3, and they did pick it up, and
changed the whole.
Rest is history.
Yeah, changed the whole course. Listen to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship station, 1490 WGCH Greenwich. We'll talk about whether the Moxley murder case can ever be solved. And our guest is Len Levitt. He was in the recent Investigative Discovery episode, Guilty Rich, on the Moxley murder case, of course, the murder case that happened here in Greenwich. And as you know, Michael's been convicted, but even the Moxleys don't feel we know what really happened, etc. Michael maintains he's innocent. Is there any way that we'll ever be able to surmount reasonable doubt in this case, in your mind?
Only if there's a deathbed confession. I mean, there's a part of that night that is missing, and if in fact Michael murdered her at midnight, where was Martha all that time in between? Even if you accept the fact that she was murdered and there's a great, the idea that she was murdered at 10 o'clock, and one of the reasons that the police thought that was true is the two neighborhood dogs were barking all the time, and there was an exchange that Frank Garr had with one of the Skakel private investigators about it. And when one of the private investigators, Billy Krebs, who is an ex-NYPD lieutenant, said, "Boy, what about those dogs, Frank?" And Frank says, "Sure wish we could interview them."
And the dogs were in the O.J. Simpson murder too. So, do you think you wrote?
You think they were the same dogs?
If the police don't solve a case within 48 hours, the chances are that it'll never be. Is that the Greenwich Police Department on a burden on their shoulders? No experience, and they screwed it up? Or?
Well, this is one of the great. Yes, in my opinion. I mean, unfortunately, the Greenwich Police. Yeah, they did a lot of things wrong early on, and unfortunately, those lapses have haunted this case through today, and they're going to haunt it to the end. There's so much that we just don't know about what happened that night, and that we're probably never going to know, short of a deathbed confession.
In your mind, has Michael shown consciousness of guilt specifically, and has the family?
What does that mean, consciousness of guilt? I'm not sure. How do you mean that, Jim?
You know, they always said that the fact that O.J. got in that Bronco and was maybe trying to escape, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well,
acting out.
Yes, I think that Frank R. felt that Michael. He compared Michael to a tea kettle who was ready to burst, and he would offer little bits of information, little bits of changing his story throughout the years. And I think that Gar felt that basically there was a part of Michael that really felt guilty about what he did. Not that he was not conscious-less. There was a part of him that, and he kept on, telling people things that he didn't have to tell them. And I think Gar felt that that was
putting himself in the tree, for instance.
Putting himself in the tree, making up that story, lying to the police, and then changing, saying that he went out that night at midnight and just happened to run by the murder scene.
Do you think that Michael legitimately does not know if he committed it or not? Because the rage could imply the blackout level of violence.
I think that's possible. I think it's all. I do think that's possible. I mean, he was 15 at the time, but I also think it's possible. I know murderers who convince themselves that, or they really do convince themselves that they're innocent. There was a guy in the Bronx named Larry Davis, who shot 6 cops. He was a 20-year-old kid, and he went to jail. He was finally convicted of another murder. And he kept saying, "I never shot those cops. I never shot those cops." He was killed in prison, but at the end, he never acknowledged that he shot those cops. So
there's one issue with that too, is the body wasn't moved till 45 minutes later, which to me would imply either he was aware by then or somebody else, a.k.a. a Jimmy Terrian, moved the body.
I did not know that. Where is that coming from, Jim? Tell me.
I think Bob Drake will say that. I think it's generally accepted that there was a gap before that body was dragged.
Uh-huh.
Which is one of the reasons that Tommy's timeline is interesting. He's up with her right until the murder, and then he's with Littleton during the French Connection. But he leaves that. There's that gap period of when the body was moved.
Right. I was unaware of that.
And maybe I'm wrong with that. But
well, if Drake says it, it's probably true.
He doesn't buy the blackout theory either.
Yeah.
But I do think that he could have been blacked out.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's possible.
Tommy doesn't have a motive, and
well, Tommy really doesn't have a motive in the sense that if his story is telling the truth, that they had mutual masturbation to orgasm. Hey,
he doesn't have an issue. But
why?
But my second part of that question is what would a motive have been? The only thing I can come up with is if he was trying to. You want to use the word rape, but going beyond what she found acceptable, and she freaked out, and then he freaked out.
I guess that's true.
It's a lot less likely than the Michael scenario.
I mean, again, these stories, you can't. I don't even know if Tommy's second story was true about the mutual masturbation. I mean, that because that it just.
Okay, now if the Skagels are innocent, who in your mind would be a candidate?
The Skagels are not innocent.
There's no one else that you think, under any circumstances, even if they were found innocent.
Well, let's look at the first interpretation of the Greenwich police. Their first thought was some outsider off the turnpike came in and murdered Martha.
Picked up a golf club on the...
that just happened to be lying in the Skakel lawn. This, it's preposterous. And who else could have done it? I mean, nobody else could have done it.
That's the trouble. Is it's hard to come up with something. If the
It's
caveman
not hard.
is
It's
ruled out,
impossible. I mean, you can't even countenance the caveman theory. It's absolutely, that is so racist. You know, remember the guy, there was, as Hasbrook said, and it's really true, there was a white guy in Boston who murdered his wife, and he said, no, a black guy did it, and they found a guy, as they closed in on the guy, he jumped off the bridge and committed suicide. There was a lady in South Carolina whose kids died, and she said they were kidnapped by a black guy. It turned out she drove the car into the water with. I mean, come on, this is just pure racist stuff.
One person, Jimmy Terrian.
I don't think Terrian
could have done it.
Murdered her. I mean, there was no motive, but in my opinion, it's possible that he knew about it and helped them cover it up. But there's no motive again for Terrian. I didn't even know that Terrian knew Martha Moxley. And
as we always end up, we remember Mrs. Moxley and John Moxley, who have obviously suffered the most. And we're going to end this episode with a soundbite that John Moxley was the last thing he uttered on the Investigative Discovery show.
There was no victory in the verdict. There's no celebration in the verdict. If I was going to say anything to Michael, I'd say, the truth will set you free. You've been running from this for so long. I tell you, tell the truth. You'll never be free.
Thanks to Len Levitt. Investigative Discovery Guilty Rich Show episode on the Moxley murder is now available at idgo.com, investigativediscoverygo.com, idgo.com. Len's book again, Conviction, Solving the Moxley Murder, a reporter and detective's 20-year search for justice, available on Kindle. You've been listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Podcast available at wgch.com. Also available on YouTube, Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell and Park City Productions 06604. You can search either. And again, we'll see everybody next Monday night at 6 for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.